Well, we finally made it. It's here. Hey guys, Kid Aikino here. By the time this video is posted, the long-rumored and eagerly awaited Criterion box set of the complete Showa series of Godzilla films will have finally been released. As I'm recording this, it's October 14th. I want to get as much of this video done as I can beforehand, and then shoot that kind of cold open sequence and the review segment, and have this up by like Halloween or so. Regardless of some of the things not included, more on that later, this set is a big deal and absolutely cause for celebration. It's the first time in the history of Godzilla as a franchise that the entire original series of films has been released by one distributor, and for that matter, the first time in a while all of these films have been in print at the same time. It's the first time 8 of these films have been available on Blu-ray in North America. Hell, the UK set will be the first time most of them have been on disc in the UK, period. And it's also the first ever official licensed release of the Japanese version of King Kong vs. Godzilla in the English-speaking world. But if you're watching this video, odds are you probably know that already. The real question is, for those of us who haven't gotten ours yet, or who are waiting until the November sale at Barnes & Noble where all of Criterion's stuff is half off, how is the set? And I'll get to that. But first, let's take a look back at the history of this set and how we got to this point. So to understand the significance of these films all being released by one distributor, and why it's a minor miracle that this set exists at all, we have to look briefly at the history of the rights to these films in the US. Toho didn't strike a multi-picture deal with one distributor to release these films to American theaters in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There were a handful of regulars who released more than one film, but at least 8 different companies handled different films throughout the Showa series, with the actual distribution often being handled by other companies. The original Godzilla was recut and released as Godzilla King of the Monsters by 2 small outfits called Jewel Enterprises and Embassy Pictures, who distributed the film under the names Transworld Entertainment and Godzilla Releasing Corporation in different regions within the US. Godzilla Raids Again was originally picked up by a small studio called ABPT Pictures, who planned to adapt the film in a similar style to that eventually used for Power Rangers into a dinosaur film called The Volcano Monsters. ABPT went out of business before their version could be completed, and Warner Brothers picked up the rights, releasing an only slightly less extensively edited version called Gigantus the Fire Monster. King Kong vs. Godzilla was recut by John Beck and released by Universal. American International Pictures, a prolific producer and distributor of exploitation films, released Mothra vs. Godzilla as Godzilla vs. The Thing. They would also release Destroy All Monsters and Godzilla vs. Hedorah, the latter under the title Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster. The Walter Reed organization handled Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, which was released to American theaters, as well as Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster and Son of Godzilla, which went straight to television. Invasion of Astro Monster was released by Henry G. Saperstein's United Productions of America as Monster Zero. UPA also imported All Monsters Attack under the title Godzilla's Revenge, and released Terror of Mechagodzilla to television with a new prologue created using footage from the previous 2 films. A company called CinemaShares International Distribution imported Godzilla vs. Gigan, Godzilla vs. Megalon, and Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, taking Toho's pre-made export versions and trimming violence and profanity to obtain G ratings. Gigan was released as Godzilla on Monster Island, and Mechagodzilla was initially promoted as Godzilla vs. the Bionic Monster. Prior to the film's release, Universal stepped in claiming that CinemaShares' title infringed on its trademarks relating to the $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman. CinemaShares got as much mileage as it could out of the free publicity before changing the title to Godzilla vs. the Cosmic Monster. Finally, Terror of Mechagodzilla holds the distinction of having been released in America twice. While UPA released a nearly uncut version to television, it was also released to theaters as The Terror of Godzilla by Bob Kahn Enterprises, who took a similar approach to CinemaShares. Bob Kahn, however, were much more overzealous, editing the film relentlessly until they arrived at a final cut that achieved a G rating, at the price of being completely incoherent at times, since key plot points had been cut due to violence. This version was accidentally substituted for UPAs on the first American VHS release of the film, and remained the only version of the film available in the US for nearly 20 years. Most of these films received multiple home video releases from different companies throughout the VHS era and the early days of DVD. Licensing and rights deals being less public and well documented back then, it can be hard to follow and account for every release. Godzilla vs. Megalon in particular was released on innumerable unlicensed tapes thanks to a misconception that a specific edit of the film had fallen into the public domain, making it difficult to say who, if anyone, actually had the rights at a given time. A handful of legally dubious low-quality tapes from Scimitar around 1990 muddy the waters for other films as well. However, some films are easier to trace, and we have a pretty good idea whose hands these films have passed through over the last 15 to 20 years. 5 of them wound up bundled together in a UPA syndication package, along with Rodan, Frankenstein Conquers the World, War of the Gargantuas, some Toho Dracula films, and an edited version of the notorious Prophecies of Nostradamus. Paramount released 8 of these films in 1994. Scimitar famously released the Godzilla titles to VHS and DVD in 1998, and Classic Media released those films minus Astro Monster and plus Rodan in 2002, after acquiring the lion's share of the UPA library. Meanwhile, the rights to many of the remaining films had reverted to Toho sometime around 1998. Anime distributor ADV licensed Destroy All Monsters in 1999, and Godzilla vs. Megalon's rights were tied up with Good Times Entertainment, who licensed the film in the 1990s only to go bankrupt before they could release it on DVD. Classic Media acquired the Golden Books film and television library in 2001, including Godzilla Raids Again and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, though these were passed over for their 2002 DVDs. In 2004, while releasing the Millennium films to DVD through their subsidiary TriStar, Sony also licensed the 5 remaining Showa films: Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, Son of Godzilla, Godzilla vs. Hedorah, Godzilla vs. Gigan, and Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. They released these films on DVD over the course of 2004 and 2005, with their original Japanese audio as well as Toho's export dub tracks. 2005 also saw Universal release bare-bones, low-effort, but reasonably high-quality DVDs of its 2 Toho Kong films, King Kong vs. Godzilla and King Kong Escapes, in their dubbed edited US versions only. From 2006 to 2008, Classic Media re-released the UPA Godzilla films on DVD along with Rodan and War of the Gargantuas, plus the 2 films from the Golden Books acquisition. While they couldn't provide brand new transfers like Sony had, they distinguished themselves by including the Japanese and US versions of all 9 films they had, including the UPA TV version of Terror of Mechagodzilla. They also allowed 2 of the UPA films to revert to Toho, Prophecies of Nostradamus because Toho had adopted kind of a Song of the South policy on it since licensing it to UPA, and Frankenstein Conquers the World for some reason. Who can tell with Toho? Classic Media also released the original film on Blu-ray in 2009, but this disc was just an upscale of the standard definition DVD master. At some point, probably around 2009, Destroy All Monsters rights reverted to Toho, and Media Blasters licensed it and Godzilla vs. Megalon in 2011, kicking off what would become a long and convoluted saga for these 2 films. Destroy All Monsters was released on DVD and Blu-ray as planned, however the bonus features contain a great deal of material that Toho hadn't approved or necessarily gotten the proper clearances for. The discs were quickly pulled from distribution, and the planned release of Godzilla vs. Megalon, set for later that year, was put on indefinite hold. Megalon was eventually released to DVD only in a bare-bones edition without extras in 2012, though some discs still featured the extras intended for the original release due to an error at the disc manufacturing plant. You can't make this stuff up. Both films were eventually reissued on bare-bones DVD and Blu-ray in 2014, with Destroy All Monsters lacking the US English dub present on its 2011 release. In 2011, Criterion teased a release of the original Godzilla with a picture of a film can posted to their Facebook page. Their DVD and Blu-ray, created through a sub-licensing agreement with Classic Media, were released in early 2012 with restored versions of the original film and the US version with Raymond Burr, the latter restored from various fan-owned film materials. 2014, like 1998 before it, was a big year for Godzilla home video releases, with a number of releases riding the wave of anticipation for Gareth Edwards' new film. Universal reissued the Kong films on Blu-ray. While Sony reissued their Godzilla titles from the 90s onward on Blu-ray, they allowed their Showa series titles to revert back to Toho. 3 of these, Sea Monster, Hedorah, and Gigan, were picked up by Kraken Releasing, a division of anime distributor Section 23, and given quick, cheap Blu-ray and DVD releases using the same sources as Sony's DVDs. After that, not a whole lot happened for a few years, except for various releases going out of print as the related licensing contracts expired. And that's when things got interesting. In late 2017, 10 Godzilla films, plus Rodan and War of the Gargantuas, appeared on the Starz streaming platform with Criterion-branded artwork. These included the 6 Godzilla sequels that Classic Media had previously had the license to, plus the 2 Media Blasters had released, and the 2 ex-Sony films that Kraken hadn't bothered with for some reason. Some of these featured Toho's export dubs, including their edit of the US dub of Invasion of Astro Monster, and the rare War of the Gargantuas export dub, while others, generally those without such dubs, featured newly translated subtitles. All of them featured Toho's 2008 HD transfers, more on those later. People immediately began speculating about Criterion disc releases of these films, or, as seemed more likely, a box set. It didn't take long for that speculation to turn to assembling a set of the entire Showa series. Criterion has a long-standing relationship with Universal and could probably license King Kong vs. Godzilla from them, as they routinely did for other films, and Kraken, a budget label putting out quick and cheap discs explicitly aimed at the impulse shopper, seemed unlikely to turn down free money for Criterion to handle their films. In reality, though, it would be a while, as Criterion's strategy favored a waiting game as opposed to a mess of sub-licensing agreements for various individual titles. It seems that most of the recent licensing agreements Toho had made with US distributors for their films had been for round, simple numbers. 5 or 10 years, mostly 5. I think whatever deal Toho made with Classic Media that allowed their line of DVDs might have been for 10 years. I remember those DVDs being in stores in 2014, over 5 years after the last few were released. But I think they went out of print at some point between then and the same film's appearance on Starz, which suggests that Criterion probably licensed these films at that point once the deal expired. It's also possible that Classic Media had their films more or less indefinitely, but passed them along to Criterion anyway, as they had no plans of their own for further releases. The 2 Media Blasters films had probably been 5-year deals that expired in 2016, while Son of Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla were already up for grabs after the expiration of Sony's deal in 2014, about 10 years after the initial licensing agreement. After that, it was a matter of waiting for Kraken's 5-year deal from 2014 to expire, which it finally did in March 2019, allowing Criterion to license Sea Monster, Hedorah, and Gigan, leaving only King Kong vs. Godzilla, which would require bringing Universal and Toho to the table to sort out some specifics of the original 60s contracts in order to secure the Japanese version. In the meantime, though, the Starz films spread to a few more streaming platforms, including the dearly departed Filmstruck and eventually the Criterion channel, while fans eagerly speculated about the various versions of the films that might be included in an eventual box set, the challenges that the restoration process might pose, and what sources might produce the best results. Criterion responded to general inquiries about the box set with a boilerplate email stating roughly, "We're interested in getting these films out on physical formats, but they're not on our schedule yet." More detailed inquiries offering to put Criterion in contact with private collectors who might have film materials they could use received responses that, while still vague, strongly suggested that something was in the works, and it was. But in the end, the fans reaching out and speculating, myself included, may have jumped the gun. But more on that later. The reason we're here is that after almost 2 years, countless forum threads and Reddit comments full of speculation, and the suspense of a repeatedly delayed announcement, the Criterion set is finally here. So, what's in the box?
What's in the box?
So just for starters, let's have a look at the packaging here. As you can see, it's pretty big. I'm having to lean back a considerable amount just to get it all in the frame. But yeah, as you can see, the whole thing is set up as this large format book type package. The cover has an interesting texture. I remember the president or CEO of Criterion in an interview mentioning that it felt like skin. I don't know what kind of skin exactly he's thinking of, but this does have an interesting texture to it. It's got this kind of grippy feel to it, not like a glossy finish. I'm having trouble thinking of another example, but you know, it's a pretty common type of thing, but interesting for a book like this. Turning over to the back here, we have kind of the, you know, the selling points, the information of this release. It's all on this big card here that's, I believe, stuck to the back cover with the kind of adhesive they use when mailing credit cards or, you know, scent samples in magazines. Let's just peel this off here and have a look at the back. Yep. See, there it is. And that should just peel right off. One solid piece. Makes something fun to play around with for about a minute there. And on the back here you can see we have this really nice image of Godzilla walking back out to sea. There's a great little video on Criterion's website showing kind of an interview and demonstration with the artist who designed this artwork. Now you've probably heard me say this or seen me say this if you follow me on Twitter or if you're on the Toho Kingdom or blu-ray.com boards, that I'm not the biggest fan of this overall package style, neither in terms of the size and format nor the artwork. Criterion as a label has this sort of cultured or sophisticated image that they tend to be associated with and informs their generally minimalist design, so this kind of very loud comic book art style with this never mind the bollocks color scheme is it's a little odd, and I feel like maybe condescending slightly to the films in a way. I mean, you know, obviously they're trying to sell these, and so they're giving credit where it's due when they're talking about it, but I can't help but, you know, sort of feel like it's just, oh, you know, it's a pop culture thing. It's like comic books. It's, you know, it's big and colorful, therefore it's, you know, 60s pop art, which, I mean, maybe Hedera, maybe maybe Megalon, but it doesn't seem completely appropriate for all of these, but overall that's kind of a minor point. As we go through the inside here, we have the liner notes by Steve Rifle. I think some special features lists still mention the essay by Jay Hoberman from the original Blu-ray release of the 1954 film. That doesn't seem to be in here, but I think it's on their website, so not a huge loss there. And once you get past that essay, you have the inside here with descriptions and notes on the films and the large format cover art. And some of these I'm a bigger fan of than others. Like, I really enjoy this one for Godzilla Raids Again. The King Kong vs. Godzilla cover is one of the best. But then there are others that I'm a little less enamored of. Just for instance, let me see here. Oh, I love the All Monsters Attack artwork. That one's another favorite, and I think, you know, it does convey in a very literal sense the point of view of the film in general. I do like that, but some of these I'm less of a huge fan of. Oh, this one's good. This is Becky Cloonan. I'm mainly familiar with her work from True Lives of the Fabulous Killjoys, but, you know, she's done plenty of stuff, including other Criterion editions. The Megalon artwork is an example of one I'm kind of torn about. I like the Mushroom Cloud Godzilla, but something about the way the bottom half is drawn kind of, I don't know, it reminds me of like pre-2010 Flash animation in a way. I'm not as huge a fan of that aesthetic. And then the Terror of Mechagodzilla artwork, which, you know, It's not a bad image, but the, seemingly intentionally ridiculous sound effects all over it kind of drag the whole thing down for me a bit. And back here we've got our information on the transfers and everything. I'll have plenty more to say about those in a minute. And another really nice image right here from the same artist who did the outside covers. And we finally flip back here to the 8 discs. Now, they do put, multiple films on a disc. Not every one of them has its own disc. They do have 3 on some of them, and I believe at least some of these, at least disc 3, are some of the longer films in the Showa series, so maybe not the best choice for tripling up there, but, we'll see how it looks, I guess. But it seems like a bit of a compression hazard when it might have been easier to do that with some of the later films, like All Monsters Attack especially. Only about 70 minutes, that one. It would be really easy to fit, 2 other films on there with that. And then finally our supplements disc over here where, due to the negotiations involved in securing it for this release, probably the King Kong vs. Godzilla Japanese cut was forced to be included here rather than on the disc where it technically officially goes. That right there is the US version. And so yeah, I'm going to take a few hours to kind of get familiar with the presentations of each of the films and have a look at the supplements there, and I'll report back on that. So I've just gone and previewed all of these discs, and real quick I just want to give another note on the packaging. So a lot of people, when it became known that the discs were going to be housed in these kind of cardboard sleeves, they expressed concern about damage to the surface of the discs. Now, Blu-ray discs are, already more scratch resistant than DVDs, so it's already not that much of a concern. But what's nice about this set is that the surface behind the discs here is actually made of a more kind of glossy, smooth material, so it's even less likely to damage the discs. I thought that was a really nice touch. However, I have to say, even with that taken into account, the discs are still kind of difficult to remove. Not as difficult, I would say, as some people have said, but you sort of have to hook your thumb in the outside ridge and then get one finger into the center there in order to get them out. It's not that ideal for getting them out easily, but it does work. So I've briefly sampled each film in the set at this point, so I'm just gonna go down the line and talk a little bit about each one. Starting on disc 1, we have the original film and its US version, Godzilla King of the Monsters. This is basically the same content as the 2012 disc. However, it's not the exact same disc with a new label slapped on it. There's a new menu that kind of suits the overall design philosophy of this set, and they are still the same transfers. It's still the same Criterion restorations, and they still look great. However, they are new encodes, and they do feature the Janus Films logo before the film proper as well. I don't think that was there on the old disc, and it's there on all the films in this set actually, so that was actually one of the things I was kind of looking forward to about this set, not because it was a big deal, but just because it's fun to be able to pop in something like All Monsters Attack or Godzilla vs. Megalon and see the Criterion and Janus logos before the Toho logo. Like, it's just fun. I just get a kick out of that, just for how, I don't want to say maligned, but not very acclaimed, for their reputation over the years. It's just kind of fun to see that. One other thing about the Godzilla 54 disc, it's basically a remake of the original disc from 2012, the same content and everything, same supplements, but it is, remade from the ground up. So the actual subtitle track is new, same translation, new track, and they've given the subtitles a thicker and darker border this time around, which is actually really helpful, because the old one had a really thin translucent border around the subtitles, and it, made them a bit hard to read sometimes, especially on a black and white film. Moving on to Disc 2 with Godzilla Raids Again, we have the first of the touched-up Toho transfers. This being a black and white film, there's basically not much more to do than adjust the contrast on the black levels, and there's nothing really to be done for the detail in this film. It's not coming back from a bad telecine, but the adjusted levels do it some good. Of course, it is missing the US version, Gigantus the Fire Monster. The only US versions in any of this set are for the original and for King Kong vs. Godzilla, and if Toho had their way, probably not even that one, but because it's a deal with Universal, there wasn't really a way around it. Now, the version of King Kong vs. Godzilla on this disc is the US version. Due to their deal with Universal, presumably they had to treat the US version as the primary version on the set, so it takes the actual movie slot in the set. There's not a whole lot to say about this transfer, honestly. It's been out since 2014 on Blu-ray from Universal. It looks alright. It's not a painstaking restoration with everything, sweetened to just as good as it could look, but it's a decent, competent HD transfer. It looks alright. Moving on to Disc 3, we start off with Mothra vs. Godzilla and start getting into the color films taken from Toho transfers. Now, the thing about these transfers is there's really not a whole lot of detail in them. They're pretty soft. So all Criterion could really do was adjust the colors, and mostly that seems to have been restricted to just turning up the contrast, or adjusting the black levels, rather. There is one bit early on in Mothra vs. Godzilla where there does seem to have been some substantial color correction done. It's the shot on the opening of the pumps blowing out the floodwaters. But other than that, it does still pretty much just look like, boosting the contrast a bit. The color in a lot of the rest of the film doesn't seem to have been touched up too much. A lot of it still looks very, very yellow. But with that said, the boosted contrast does still flatter these transfers, I'd say. They're still very soft, of course, but the better black levels kind of give the impression of maybe watching a 35mm release print or something like that. It's not like a scan off the negative where everything's just pin sharp all the time. It's a little soft, but it's got some nice contrast to it. The colors pop better than they do on anything Toho's issued. And that massaged presentation does look especially good on Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, which had earlier elements to work from than did Mothra vs. Godzilla or Invasion of Astro Monster, the other two films on this disc. More on that situation later, but the Toho transfer of Ghidorah probably had the best native colors of any of the Showa era transfers they did. And so with Criterion's boosts to the levels, or rather their, lowering of the shadows down to a better level, it really does pop. This film does look pretty nice on there. Again, not a lot of detail, but it's like watching maybe a nice theatrical print or something like that. Invasion of Astro Monster still looks fairly rough and mostly uncorrected in terms of color. Black levels, of course, but other than that, not too obvious a difference, and there's nothing that noticeable on most of these films besides that. The one thing about Astro Monster is on the streaming platform they just took Toho's transfer as is, and that had the English Toho logo in it because of the foreign element used to make that transfer. Toho swapped it out for the proper Japanese logo on their Blu-ray, but Criterion seems to have left it as is. It's nothing big, but it's kind of interesting. This is also the first one where they provide a dub track synced up to the Japanese version. It's billed as an international dub, but it's really just Toho taking the existing US dub and syncing it back up to the Japanese cut of the film, filling in the blanks left by the US cut with audio from the Japanese version, which is mostly Yoshio Tsuchiya's Planet X language, and at one point I think the unfinished on-set audio, just to fill in a line from Nick Adams that was cut. This dub does feature Nick Adams doing his own voice, which is great. Losing that would have been a real shame, as his performance is pretty memorable. He kind of brings the... he plays up the American swagger in contrast to the actors around him. He's a lot of fun to watch in this one, and it's great that we have his actual dubbing of his own lines to listen to on this set. Moving on to disc 4, we have Ebirah, the Horror of the Deep, also known as Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster. This one was issued on Blu-ray by Kraken. It had a much sharper transfer, but much cooler colors, and this transfer's colors aren't perfect, but they look a little more neutral, a little more natural, I'd say. Less lush, but more balanced, maybe. And again, it's definitely softer, but it has a really nice contrast to it with the way Criterion has sweetened it up a little bit. There's no international dub on this one, despite the fact that Toho has one on hand, which they provided to Sony, which later provided it to Kraken, but that's not included here for some reason. I don't think it's a big loss. I don't think it's that great a dub, but, you know, having no English option for it whatsoever when there is one that would presumably meet Toho's standards of authenticity, it is a little bit of a shame. We do have the dub of Son of Godzilla, which is a plus. What's unfortunate, though, is the transfer for this one has some of the worst colors out of the Toho transfers that weren't kind of hamstrung by inferior elements like Mothra Versus and Astro Monster. The whole film has a very yellow cast, and Criterion doesn't seem to have done a whole lot with it. Destroy All Monsters, though, looks pretty terrific, especially in comparison to the old Media Blasters disc, which somehow made the black levels from Toho's transfer even worse, even lighter. We do have the Toho-approved export dub for this one as well, and what's also nice is the transfer is competently de-interlaced. The Toho transfers being done straight to HD videotape were interlaced, which means that anyone issuing them on Blu-ray or anything with a progressive frame rate has to de-interlace them, and Media Blasters kind of botched this on their release. There's not constant ghosting all over the place, but every cut between shots kind of blends a little bit. It looks weird, it looks bad. It's nice to finally have a copy of this film without that error on it. Moving right along, we have All Monsters Attack. Not much to say about this one, it looks pretty nice. They do subtitle the opening theme song in the Japanese version here. However, when it overlaps with credits on screen, the priority goes to subtitling the credits, so some of the lyrics do go untranslated a little bit, but honestly, it's maybe not a principled reaction to have, but I don't think anyone likes that song that much, so it's not a tremendous loss. We do, however, lack the English dub here, which is probably the biggest shame, other than lacking the US versions in general, just because this one didn't have an export dub, seemingly, and so we're missing the dub here, which means it's, you know, inaccessible to the children's audience that it was aimed at, and also just honestly an all-around more entertaining way to watch the film, so that's kind of a shame. We do have, also on disc 5, Godzilla vs. Hedorah. This is another one with a theme song during the credits, so you do have that kind of overlap and that slight conflict. However, the luckily enough, the best lyrics seem to come when there are no credits on screen, so we get that translated. I'm really glad to finally have that translated on an official release. the Sony and Kraken discs didn't bother to translate it, and it's got some really good lyrics. And there is also the benefit of the theme song being repeated a few times throughout the film, so later on when there are no credits to, compete with, you do get the full translation of the lyrics. Next we have Godzilla vs. Gigan. This one has been talked about a bit because you're finally getting the cartoon speech balloons between Godzilla and Anguillus. That is nice. It's, it's not a huge thing, and it's not, full compensation for the loss of the Sony transfer's clarity and quality. Same goes for Godzilla vs. Hedorah. That one also had a Sony transfer put out by Kraken. It is a shame to see these films kind of downgraded in terms of visual clarity, and also lacking their export dubs, which in Gigan's case is probably my preferred way to watch the film. It's a fun dub, and it's a shame not to have it there, but at least we have speech balloons. Next up we have Godzilla vs. Megalon. Not much to say about this one. We do have the export dub there. This is another case where Media Blasters kind of botched the deinterlacing, even worse than Destroy All Monsters, actually. So it's really great to, finally have a better copy of that one. And it's great to have the dub too. Again, preferred way to watch some of these 70s films. Somehow the Hong Kong dubs really just suit the 70s films. They kind of just hit the same notes. It works, Then on disc 7 we have Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and Terror of Mechagodzilla. These are two of the softest Toho transfers, which is kind of a shame, but Criterion does what they can with it. The colors are alright. And we do have the dubs for both, so, that's good. Finally, on the supplements, we have some interesting stuff. We have, of course, the Japanese version of King Kong vs. Godzilla. I can't really tell if that's gotten Criterion's sweetening their little adjustments. The Criterion and Janus logos, I don't think, show up before the film, but, it's there. After so long not being available at all in the US, it is there, even if it is not a very good transfer, even if parts of it are still from a Laserdisc transfer. It's there, and it's subtitled. It's you take what you can get with Toho, I suppose. And finally, we have the rest of it's mostly interviews. You have a brief piece with Alex Cox, director who I'm a fan of personally, talking about his admiration for the Godzilla films. It's not all that insightful as a supplement, but it's something I enjoyed seeing. I like Alex Cox. I think he's an interesting filmmaker. Clearly has an appreciation for, kind of surreal and fanciful films. He's certainly made plenty of his own, but he's not exactly giving us, earth-shattering revelations about the making of these films or deep analysis or anything like that. Nonetheless, it is nice to see something of a respected Western director talking about, how much he likes these films. After that, you have interviews with the suit actor who played Jaguar, and with Bin Furuya, who eventually played Ultraman. He was the suit actor for the original Ultraman. He was also a bit player in a lot of Toho movies before that, and he has some, neat little anecdotes to share about his co-stars and things like that, and the experience of working for Toho at the time, which was really more like, it was like having a job at the studio, acting in those days. Japan had a very vertically integrated, all-encompassing studio system for a while longer than Hollywood did. And so there's some interesting stories there. There's also an hour-long interview with Ishiro Honda, conducted for the Directors Guild of Japan by Yoshimitsu Banno, the director of Godzilla vs. Hedorah. That's the one I look forward to watching the most, just for the sheer volume of it. A lot of these longer interviews don't get fully translated and published in the US, and we kind of rely on a lot of secondhand things through books by Western authors and things like that for what these filmmakers actually said and felt about their experiences. So it's nice to have such an extensive, substantial first-hand source like that. There's also an hour-long television program, I think it's for television, a documentary of some kind of unused, deleted, and behind-the-scenes footage from the Toho special effects crew, including a fair amount of, I believe, the Godzilla films. I think this is where the footage from Destroy All Monsters of Godzilla tussling with Manda comes from. Fairly famous as a deleted scene, might have just been Nakajima goofing around. Whatever the case, I'm pretty sure that's in there. I only gave it a quick look. It starts off with a fair amount of stuff from war films, actually, so there's non-Godzilla stuff in there as well. That one looks like a really interesting supplement to this whole thing. I look forward to watching more of that as well. And then finally we have trailers for the Japanese versions of all the films other than the original, which has trailers on its own disc. Some of these are Champion Festival reissue trailers, but there is one for every film in the set. What's interesting is there's one for Godzilla Raids Again, which I'd been under the impression that the trailer for that one was actually lost, or at least didn't exist visually. They just had audio or something like that and had to recreate it. I don't know if this is the same one that I heard that about, but it's kind of interesting because it cuts off abruptly at the end and seems to be leading into a trailer for Rodan. So I do wonder if this is something that played later in Godzilla Raids Again's theatrical run, but that was interesting. I hadn't seen that before. And the trailers are all fully translated as well, which is great. A lot of the times you see these included, there's not a translation with them. I think possibly the first non-Criterion thing I saw with any of the Showa trailers translated was would be the Kraken discs. So those did blaze some new trails there, I suppose. But yeah, all in all, Criterion did a good job within Toho's limitations, but Toho's limitations are definitely felt here. They did a fairly decent job kind of flattering and bringing out the best in Toho's transfers, but it's a shame we didn't get to see what Criterion could have done for these films themselves, or especially for any of the alternate versions that Toho nixed. But unfortunately, they are getting more and more demanding, seemingly with every passing year. It seems like a new requirement that wasn't necessarily expected of other labels, but seems to be standard practice with Criterion. The Japanese versions of these films all seem to have English copyright notices added to their end title cards, similar to how they did with the original Godzilla on the 2012 disc. For the widescreen films, they managed to get away with putting them just outside the actual frame, so the actual image of the film is still untouched. But Godzilla Raids Again, being an Academy ratio film, or 137 film, it's kind of SOL there. But luckily, the new notices are smaller and less conspicuous than the ones they added to the original. But yeah, all in all, that's the set. As far as I've been able to tell, I haven't watched a whole film off it at this point. I haven't watched any of the supplements straight through, except for Alex Cox's piece. But yeah, those are kind of my first thoughts, first impressions of the set. So with that out of the way, let's get into a little more detail on Toho's restrictions and why these are, kind of so unfortunately compromised, even though Criterion seems to have generally done their best. So as we've seen, the presentation of the films on this set does leave something to be desired. A handful of fans predicted this before the set's official announcement. I didn't want to believe it myself, but here we are. The long-awaited, years-in-the-making Criterion box set of the entire Showa Godzilla series is using 11-year-old Toho HD transfers for nearly everything in it, not to mention omitting any English language versions whatsoever for 7 films. How did this happen? Well, if you've been a Godzilla fan for any length of time, the answer probably won't come as much of a surprise. It's pretty much all Toho's fault. Indeed, when a home video label known for spearheading painstaking restoration efforts and presenting the films they release in the best quality they can manage, drops a mega pack of films presented in, by their usual standards, objectively mediocre quality, it shouldn't be too difficult to figure out what's going on when the licensor is as infamously difficult and seemingly irrational as Toho is. Toho has nerfed US disc releases of Godzilla films often deliberately for decades. Sometimes it's for fear of reverse imports of affordable US releases by Japanese fans, like when they forced ADV to issue Destroy All Monsters as what amounted to a VHS tape on a disc. Sometimes it's a seemingly punitive thing when a distributor goes over their head, like when they gutted Media Blaster's planned releases of Destroy All Monsters and Godzilla vs. Megalon over a handful of unapproved extras. Sometimes it's out of simple bureaucratic inefficiency, like when Echo Bridge had to drop an audio commentary from their 2012 DVD and Blu-ray release of Godzilla vs. Biollante in order to make their release date, just because Toho was taking so long to approve it. With that history in mind, it should probably be pretty obvious that that's what happened here. They'd been interested in giving the films a more extensive treatment than just turning up the contrast on ancient telecines, probably including the various US English dubs and alternate cuts, but Toho put their foot down. So where does this leave the future of the Godzilla series with regard to preservation and home video? The vast majority of these films only exist in their complete form through the same 2008 transfers that Toho released on Blu-ray in Japan, and more recently foisted on Criterion. These have a reputation among Godzilla fans, but here's why these things are so bad. In 2008, Toho commissioned quick and cheap high-definition telecines of their back catalog of Godzilla films. Despite Tokyo Laboratory having more recent and more capable machines available, Toho went for the cheapest and fastest option available, real-time telecines made on a Sintel C-Reality, a machine from the late 1990s. Let me explain the difference between telecine and scanning. In digital photography, you have the option of shooting either in a RAW format or straight to a compressed format like JPEG. RAW files are comparatively very large, but give you the almost completely unprocessed data generated by the camera's sensor, meaning you have more information to work with when editing the photo with minimal loss of quality. JPEG has a more manageable size and gives you a more versatile file without editing, but sacrifices a lot of information, particularly in terms of dynamic range, which means the image is less flexible in an editing environment. The difference between telecine and scanning is similar. Scanning can output digital files in any number of formats, with benefits similar to shooting raw image files. It can also be done at slower speeds to capture as much information as possible. Telecine is generally a real-time process that outputs ready-to-use video at the cost of the highest possible quality and flexibility, much like shooting JPEGs. It can yield good results, but Toho's priorities were time and cost, so the Godzilla films received very soft transfers straight to video, likely HD cam tapes. Toho then smoothed over video noise introduced during the telecine process, seemingly by applying a slight blur filter, obliterating whatever fine detail was left, and overcorrected for the NTSC-J color standard used in Japan by setting the black levels too high and skewing the colors kind of warm and yellow to varying degrees. They then tried to market this treatment as something remarkable, with promotional materials calling it pure high vision. Also worth mentioning are the further limitations placed on these transfers by Toho's preservation practices in the late 1960s. For much of the 20th century, the preservation of films and television broadcasts was seen by studios and networks as inessential, or at least not profitable enough to be justified. Toho was no exception, as became evident with the introduction of the Toho Champion Festival in 1969. The Champion Festival was a series of seasonal, extended children's matinee programs headlined either by new tokusatsu films or edited reissues of older ones. The first Champion Festival featured the debut of All Monsters Attack, with the second spotlighting a re-edited King Kong vs. Godzilla. The third included the first run of Space Amoeba, and the fourth and fifth featured edits of Mothra vs. Godzilla and Invasion of Astro Monster, respectively. These re-edits were carried out on the original negatives of the films being reissued, causing serious problems with their preservation down the road. The cut portions of King Kong vs. Godzilla were left without suitable film sources for its 2008 HD transfer, resulting in those portions being sourced from a Laserdisc transfer made in 1991. The rediscovery of some of the trimmed segments, as well as Universal's HD transfer of the US version in 2014, allowed Toho to replace most of the Laserdisc material for the film's Blu-ray release, with the exception of numerous portions of the first reel. This is the version that appears on the Criterion set as a bonus feature, despite a complete 4K restoration being carried out in 2016, with a few minor errors corrected by earlier this year. That restoration is only aired on television in Japan, though, and hasn't been released on disc, so Criterion is stuck with portions of the Japanese version taken from a 28-year-old standard definition transfer. The effects on Mothra vs. Godzilla and Invasion of Astro Monster are perhaps less severe, but still noticeable. Both of these films look more faded and unstable than the other pure high visions, because the best elements Toho has for the complete films are dupe materials created for foreign distribution. Fine detail is even more absent than in the other transfers, and the yellowing that marks all of them to varying degrees overpowers the faded colors in these dupes even more. Luckily, the next Champion release, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, seems to have been where they stopped cutting on the original negatives, instead using dupe negatives. As a result, this and the subsequently reissued film's high-vision transfers look, mediocre, but not worse than the films that weren't recut at all. In fact, Ghidorah is one of the better ones in terms of color. If Toho hadn't rethought their practices at that point, a lot more of these films would look a lot worse on video today. Still though, a series of TV broadcasts of new scans of the Champion Festival edits earlier this year illuminate the problems with all of the older transfers even more harshly. For one thing, it's now clear how gorgeous and lush the original colors of Kong, Mothra, and Astro Monster were, and how much of that was lost in the analog duplication process and the grading of the high-vision transfers. For another, in a comparison that's even more unflattering for the high-vision transfer process, the old transfers of the other films have maybe as much detail as the Champion scans from dupe negatives, if not slightly less. Let's think about that. Judging by behind-the-scenes promotional footage for the high visions, the specific materials used were likely low-contrast positives, created directly from the negatives, specifically for transfer to video. These were probably originally created for Toho's DVD releases, and were used to avoid having to color correct for the orange tints of interpositives, which were the most common sources for video transfers that didn't entail extensive, painstaking restoration. Both these low-contrast prints and interpositives are one generation removed from the original camera negatives, and in this case the low-contrast materials would be much newer, since interpositives were used to create duplicate negatives, which in turn were used to create release prints during the film's original exhibition. Detail is lost and contrast is added in each round of duplication, meaning that these materials retain a good deal more detail than prints shown in theaters, and only slightly less than the original negatives, with loss in the shadows and highlights mitigated even further in the low-contrast positives. That's all very technical, and I don't blame you if you're a bit lost, but here's what it means when comparing the high-vision transfers to the Champion Festival scans. The transfers made from, at most, 20-year-old materials only one generation removed from the original negatives show only as much detail, or even less, than nearly 50-year-old materials at least one generation farther from the negative, scanned competently on modern hardware, even when the latter are viewed as lower bitrate television recordings. That's how profoundly Toho mishandled the high-vision transfers, and yet they're still milking them domestically and forcing them on competent, dedicated restorationists abroad, allowing them little more control over the visual presentation than just nudging the contrast slider. So that's what Criterion and we are stuck with. Now, don't get me wrong, these transfers are profoundly technically flawed, yes, but they're watchable, especially with Criterion's tweaks, and they're not even the worst kaiju film transfers on the market. Kadokawa's HD transfers of the Showa Gamera films, which appeared on Mill Creek's Blu-rays, are worse, and I do hope Arrow Video remedies that situation now that they've got the rights. I've seen some people say that these are likely to be the last physical releases these films ever receive stateside, making the missed opportunity for proper restorations even more lamentable. I don't think that's true personally. I don't have any illusions about the fact that streaming is becoming more popular with the average consumer, but I'm not convinced physical media is going away. It'll probably be 5 or 10 years before somebody else gets another crack at these films, and that's a shame, but I don't believe it'll never happen. Here's what'll probably happen. In a few years, maybe a few more, Toho will finally decide to commission quick, cheap 4K transfers of the Godzilla series. By that point, though, the quick and cheap options will be a lot better than they were in 2008. I doubt they exactly splurged on those champion scans, and look how much better those are already. Once those are out in Japan, either Criterion will revisit the set, or once their rights expire, somebody else will step in and pick the rights up, and those transfers will make their way over here. Of course, barring a complete paradigm shift at Toho, the US versions will probably still be neglected, but things will almost certainly get better. The problem is just that, by all accounts, they should be already. In the meantime, though, under the circumstances, I still think the set that is worth getting one's hands on, and I wouldn't discourage anyone from buying it if they're interested. It's got all the original Japanese versions all in one place. For once, if someone were to ask where to find any of the first 15 Godzilla films, or which editions to look for, the answer is simple. The disappointment I and some others feel is mainly due to the very real potential for what could have easily been if it weren't for Toho's obstruction. Those things were the reason Criterion getting these films as opposed to any other label was something to get excited about, but this set ended up illuminating the fact that with the way Toho currently deals with US distributors, it ultimately makes little difference who those distributors are. But at the end of the day, these films all being in print again on any label, and all in one place for the first time, is still something to celebrate, and if any existing US home video release is worth owning, this one certainly is, and I'm glad to have it. Thanks a lot for watching, as always. This video ended up a lot longer than I anticipated, so kudos if you've stuck it out to the end. Shout out, as always, to Exploder Button, and There Is No God But Godzilla, and Mothra is his prophet, who signed up briefly in July, and somehow I missed that. I'll be moving on to the next project in pretty short order here, so stay tuned for that. I'm also going to have to come up with a 500 subscribers special soon. That's very exciting, but I'm completely unprepared. So keep an eye out for that too, I guess. And yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Check me out on Patreon, my other social media. I'll catch you guys next time.